I never thought a name could carry so much power. But in my world, it did. In our world, it was everything. My name is Vincent Caruso, and I lived through an era that most people only know from movies, an era of shadows and silk suits, of loyalty tested by bullets and blood money counted in smoke-filled rooms. I was there when America tried to go dry and ended up drowning in its own hypocrisy. I witnessed the birth of an empire built not on factories or oil wells, but on forbidden whiskey, underground casinos, and the unspoken rules of men who answered to no law but their own. This is not a story of heroes. There were none. But it is a story of men, flawed, ambitious, ruthless men who carved their names into the spine of this nation with nothing but cunning, courage, and an iron will to survive. Men like Alphonse Gabriel Capone, who they called Scarface. Like Charles Luciano, who earned the nickname Lucky after surviving what should have been his execution. Like Meyer Lansky, the quiet accountant who turned dirty money into clean fortunes. Like Benjamin Siegel, whose vision built Las Vegas from desert dust. And like John Gotti, the Dapper Don, who decades later would remind the world that the old ways never truly die. I knew them. Not all personally, but I knew their world. I breathed the same air, walked the same streets, and played by the same brutal rules. And now, as the years have taken their toll and my hands shake when I light a cigarette, I feel the need to tell you what was really like. Not the glamorized version you see on screen, but the truth, the fear, the adrenaline, the impossible choices, and the realization that once you step into that life, there's no stepping out. Not really. Not ever. The world before the madness. It was January 1920 when everything changed. The 18th Amendment went into effect, and with the stroke of a pen, the United States government made criminals out of bartenders and saints out of bootleggers. They called it Prohibition. We called it opportunity. I was just a kid then, barely 16, working in my uncle's grocery store in Brooklyn. The neighborhood was a patchwork of Italian, Irish, and Jewish families, all trying to scratch out a living in a city that chewed people up and spit them out without a second thought. But Prohibition changed the game. Suddenly, the same whiskey that used to cost $0.25 was worth $5 a bottle on the black market. The same beer that men had been drinking openly in saloons was now contraband, hidden in basements and speakeasies that popped up faster than the cops could shut them down. And the men who controlled that flow, the supply, the distribution, the protection, they became kings. I remember the first time I saw Al Capone. It was 1925, and I had just moved to Chicago, looking for work, looking for something more than the dead-end life Brooklyn offered. Capone wasn't yet the legend he would become, but even then, you could feel the gravity around him. He walked into a restaurant on South Wabash, and the entire room seemed to lean in his direction. Men stood up. Women stared. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my father made in a year, and his face, that scar running down his left cheek, told you everything you needed to know. This was not a man who asked for things twice. Capone had come to Chicago a few years earlier, sent by Frankie Yale in New York to work for Johnny Torrio. Torrio was building an empire, and Capone was his enforcer, his strategist, his right hand. When Torrio retired in 1925 after barely surviving an assassination attempt, Capone took over the entire operation. Gambling, prostitution, bootlegging, he controlled it all. And he did it with a mix of charm and violence that kept his enemies terrified and his friends loyal. Chicago in the 1920s was a war zone. Not in the way you might imagine, with tanks and trenches, but in a way that was just as deadly. Rival gangs fought over territory with Tommy guns and sawed-off shotguns. The North Side, controlled by Irish gangsters like Dion O'Banion and Hemi Weiss, was in constant conflict with Capone's South Side operation. Men were gunned down in the streets in broad daylight. Bodies turned up in alleys, car trunks, rivers. Between 1922 and 1926, over 300 mobsters were killed in what they called the Chicago Beer Wars. And yet, the city thrived. People drank more than ever before. Jazz music poured out of speakeasies every night. Money flowed like the illegal liquor that fueled it all. I got my start running errands for one of Capone's lower-level guys. Nothing big, delivering messages, picking up packages, keeping my mouth shut. But it was enough to get me inside to see how the machine worked. And once you were inside, once you proved you could be trusted, the money came fast. Faster than anything legal could ever offer. The architects of an empire. While Capone was building his fortress in Chicago, something even bigger was happening in New York. Charles Luciano, Lucky, as everyone called him, was reimagining what organized crime could be. Luciano was different. He didn't come from wealth or privilege. Born in Sicily and brought to New York as a child, he grew up in the same rough streets as the rest of us. But he had vision. While the old guard bosses like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano fought over who would be boss of bosses, Luciano saw the bigger picture. He understood that the real power wasn't in controlling one territory or one racket. It was in collaboration, in forming alliances that stretched across ethnic lines and city borders. I met Lucky once in 1931 at a card game in Lower Manhattan. He was younger than I expected, maybe 34 or 35, with dark eyes that seemed to calculate every word, every gesture. He had survived something most men didn't, a brutal attempt on his life in 1929. 4 men had abducted him, beaten him, stabbed him repeatedly with an ice pick, slit his throat from ear to ear, and left him for dead on a Staten Island beach. But Lucky didn't die. He survived, and he never told anyone who did it. That kind of silence, that kind of strength earned respect in our world. By 1931, Luciano had had enough of the old ways. The Castellamarese War between Masuria and Maranzano had been dragging on for over a year, costing everyone money and drawing too much attention. So Lucky made a decision. On April 15, 1931, he lured Masuria to a restaurant in Coney Island and had him executed by 4 loyal men: Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel. A few months later, Maranzano was also eliminated. The old guard was gone, and Luciano stood at the center of a new order. That new order was the Commission. Luciano established it in 1931 as a governing body for organized crime across the country. It wasn't just Italians. It included Jewish mobsters like Meyer Lansky and Irish gang leaders. It was a board of directors for the Underworld, a way to settle disputes without bloodshed, to divide territories and profits fairly, and to build something that could last. It was, in a way, the most American thing imaginable, a criminal corporation. Meyer Lansky was the brains behind much of it. If Luciano was the diplomat and Capone was the warrior, Lansky was the accountant. Born in Russia and raised in New York, Lansky met Lucky when they were both kids in the 5 Points gang. While other mobsters were flashy and loud, Lansky preferred to stay in the shadows, managing the money, laundering the profits, and investing in legitimate businesses. He understood something that most gangsters didn't, that cash in a vault was worthless if the government could seize it. So he pioneered offshore banking, opening accounts in Switzerland and the Caribbean, where anonymity was protected by law. Lansky convinced the Italian bosses to put Bugsy Siegel in charge of the Las Vegas operation in 1946. The Flamingo Hotel was Siegel's vision, a luxury casino resort in the middle of the Nevada desert that would attract the rich and famous from all over the country. Lansky financed it, and for a while it looked like Siegel's gamble would pay off. But Bugsy had a problem. He was a compulsive gambler himself, and he was bleeding money. When it became clear that he was either skimming from the syndicate or simply incapable of managing the project, Lansky made the call. In June 1947, Bugsy Siegel was shot and killed in his girlfriend's home in Beverly Hills. The Flamingo went on to become one of the most successful casinos in Las Vegas history. Bugsy Siegel was a complicated man, handsome, charismatic, and absolutely terrifying when he needed to be. He earned his nickname Bugsy as in bugs, as in crazy, because of his explosive temper. People who worked with him said he could go from charming to homicidal in seconds. But he was also a visionary. He saw Las Vegas not as a dusty railroad town, but as the entertainment capital of the world. And he was right. I never met Bugsy, but I heard the stories. He was part of Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of Luciano's syndicate, responsible for carrying out hits across the country. He was sent to California in the 1930s to expand operations on the West Coast. And he did just that, building gambling dens, running prostitution rings, and consolidating control over the rackets in Los Angeles. He was untouchable for years, until he wasn't. By the late 1940s, the golden age of the mob was in full swing. Lansky controlled gambling operations in Florida, Cuba, and the Bahamas. Luciano, deported back to Italy after serving time in prison, still had his hand in the business, making deals from abroad. Capone, meanwhile, had fallen from grace. In 1931, he was convicted of tax evasion, not murder, not bootlegging, but tax evasion, and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He served time at Alcatraz, where syphilis ravaged his mind and body. By the time he was released in 1939, he was a shell of the man he once was. He died in 1947, the same year as Bugsy, at his estate in Florida, forgotten by most of the world. Life inside the machine. People always ask me what it was like, what it really felt like to be part of that world. The truth is, it was intoxicating. The money, the respect, the sense of belonging to something bigger than yourself, it was like a drug. You walked into a room, and people moved. You wanted a table at a restaurant, you got the best one. You needed a favor, it was done. But that power came at a cost. Every single day, you knew that a bullet, betrayal, or a bad decision could end it all. I worked my way up slowly, carefully. I ran numbers for a while, then moved into loan sharking, then helped manage a few speakeasies. I learned to keep my mouth shut, to never ask unnecessary questions, and to always deliver. Trust was currency in our world, and once you lost it, you were as good as dead. The violence was constant, but it wasn't random. Every hit, every beating, every threat had a purpose. It was about control, about sending a message. Cross the line, and you paid. Fail to deliver, and you paid. Betray the family, and you disappeared. It was a code, unwritten but understood by everyone. I saw men I respected get killed for mistakes I thought were forgivable. I saw men I despised live to old age because they knew when to stay quiet. The difference between survival and death often came down to luck, timing, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. One night in 1933, I was at a card game on the west side when two men burst through the door with shotguns. They were looking for someone, not me, thank God, but the fear in that room was suffocating. We all sat frozen, hands on the table, barely breathing, while they dragged one of the players outside. We heard the shots a minute later. The game resumed 10 minutes after that. Nobody said a word. That was the rule. You didn't talk about what you saw. You didn't ask questions. You just kept playing. The women in our world were different too. They weren't innocent. Most of them knew exactly what we did, and they chose to be with us anyway. Some were attracted to the danger, the money, the status. Others had no choice. They were born into it, married into it, or trapped by circumstance. But they paid a price too. They lived with the fear, the secrecy, the late-night phone calls that could mean their husband, brother, or son was never coming home. I married in 1935. Her name was Angela, and she was the daughter of a butcher in Little Italy. She knew who I was, what I did, but she never asked for details. We had an understanding. I provided, I protected, and in return, she gave me a home, a family, a reason to keep going. We had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. I loved them more than anything in the world, but I also knew that my choices had put them at risk. Every day, I carried that weight, the fall and the rise. By the 1950s, the world was changing. The government was cracking down. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, had finally acknowledged the existence of the mafia. something Hoover had denied for years, and they were coming after us with everything they had. Wiretaps, informants, RICO statutes, the tools of law enforcement were getting sharper, and the old ways of doing business were becoming dangerous. Lansky adapted. He moved more of his operations offshore, investing in casinos in Havana under the protection of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. But when Fidel Castro took over in 1959, everything fell apart. Castro seized the casinos, and Lansky lost millions overnight. He shifted to the Bahamas, to London, to anywhere he could keep the money flowing. He was never caught, never convicted of anything major. He died in 1983, a free man, though not a rich one. Most of his fortune had been seized or hidden so well that even his family couldn't find it. Luciano spent the rest of his life in exile in Italy, still pulling strings, still making deals. He died in 1962 at an airport in Naples, supposedly of a heart attack. Some say it was natural. Others think he was poisoned. Either way, his legacy lived on. The commission he created still exists, still governs, still controls vast swaths of organized crime in America. Capone's empire crumbled after his imprisonment, carved up by rivals and former allies. The outfit in Chicago survived, but it was never quite the same. Capone himself became a cautionary tale, a reminder that no matter how powerful you think you are, the law or disease or betrayal will catch up with you eventually. But the story didn't end there. Decades later, a new generation rose. John Gotti, born in the Bronx in 1940, became the face of the Gambino crime family in New York. He was everything Lansky wasn't: loud, flashy, unapologetic. He wore expensive Italian suits, styled his hair perfectly, and spoke to reporters like he was untouchable. They called him the Dapper Don, and for a while it seemed like he really was untouchable. 3 high-profile trials in the 1980s ended in acquittals, earning him the nickname the Teflon Don. But in 1992, the Teflon wore off. His underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano, turned informant, and Gotti was convicted on multiple counts of murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to life in prison and died in 2002. Gotti's downfall marked the end of an era. The old mob, with its codes and hierarchies and public displays of power, couldn't survive in the modern world. The government had too many tools, too much surveillance, too many informants. The men who stayed in the game learned to be quieter, more careful, more invisible. What we left behind. I got out in 1960. I wasn't forced out. I wasn't arrested. I just woke up one morning and realized I was tired. Tired of looking over my shoulder. Tired of attending funerals. Tired of lying to my kids about why their father came home at 3 in the morning smelling like cigarettes and fear. So I made a deal with the people I needed to make a deal with, and I walked away. I was one of the lucky ones. I moved my family to a quiet suburb outside Philadelphia. I opened a small construction business, legitimate, clean, boring. I went to my kids' school plays and little league games. I mowed the lawn on Saturdays, and I tried as hard as I could to forget the man I used to be. But you never really forget. The memories come back at strange times, when you hear a song from the old days, when you see a news story about organized crime, when you pass a restaurant that reminds you of a place that no longer exists. And sometimes late at night, I think about the men I knew. Capone, Luciano, Lansky, Siegel, Gotti. Some of them I admired. Some of them I feared. All of them I understood. They weren't monsters, not really. They were men shaped by circumstance, by ambition, by a world that told them they were nothing and then gave them a chance to be something. They made terrible choices. They hurt people. They broke laws and destroyed lives. But they also built something, a structure, a legacy, a myth that endures long after their deaths. I don't glorify what we did. I can't. I've seen too much, lost too much, to pretend it was anything other than what it was, a brutal, dangerous, morally bankrupt way of life. But I also can't deny that it was real. It happened. We lived it. And for better or worse, we left our mark on this country. My son never knew what I did before he was born. I made sure of that. But my daughter, sharp as a knife, figured it out when she was in high school. She asked me once point blank if I had ever killed anyone. I looked her in the eye and lied. I told her no. I don't know if she believed me, but she never asked again. That lie is one of many I carry with me. It's a weight I'll take to my grave. The names that never fade. Al Capone. The name still means something, even now, nearly 80 years after his death. Scarface. The big guy. The man who ruled Chicago with an iron fist and a wink. He was brutal, yes, but he was also smart, strategic, and capable of immense charm. He gave money to the poor during the Depression, opened soup kitchens, positioned himself as a Robin Hood figure, even as he ordered hits on his rivals. People loved him for it. People hated him for it. But nobody could ignore him. Lucky Luciano, the man who brought order to chaos. The father of modern organized crime. He saw what others couldn't. That collaboration was more profitable than conflict. That the future belonged to those who could think beyond their own neighborhoods. He built a criminal empire that spanned continents and outlasted his own life. Even in exile, even in death, his influence remains. Meyer Lansky, the accountant, the quiet genius who turned blood money into legitimate fortunes and understood that real power didn't come from violence, but from control of the money. He built offshore banking systems that are still used today, not just by criminals, but by corporations and governments. He was never a public figure, never a celebrity, but his fingerprints are all over the modern financial world. Bugsy Siegel, the dreamer, the madman, the visionary who looked at a desert and saw an oasis. Las Vegas exists because of him. The billions of dollars that flow through that city every year, the millions of tourists who visit, the entertainment empire it has become. It all started with Bugsy's gamble. He didn't live to see it succeed, but his ghost walks the strip every night. John Gotti, the last of the old school dons. The man who refused to hide, who believed that fear and respect were the same thing, who thought he could beat the system through sheer force of will. He was wrong, but his defiance, his style, his refusal to apologize for what he was, that made him a legend. He died in prison, but his name lives on. These were the men who built the Underworld. They were not good men, but they were unforgettable. The last reflection. I'm an old man now. My hands shake. My memory fails me sometimes. But I remember them. I remember the smoke-filled rooms and the weight of a gun in my pocket. I remember the fear and the thrill and the absolute certainty that I was living on borrowed time. I don't regret leaving. I regret ever entering. But I can't change the past. None of us can. All we can do is carry it, learn from it, and hope that the next generation makes better choices. The mob still exists. It always will in some form. But the golden age, the era of Capone and Luciano and Lansky, that's over. The world moved on. The rules changed. And the men who couldn't adapt either died or ended up in prison. I've told you this story not to glorify what we did, but to remember it, to acknowledge that it happened. That real men with real lives and real families made terrible choices and paid terrible prices. That history is not just made by presidents and generals, but by criminals and outcasts, by men who operated in the shadows and shaped the world in ways most people will never understand. This was my life. This was our world. And these were the names that history will never forget.